It's time for another book versus adaptation where I watch the adaptation, then read the book, and decide which you'll like better based on the plot, characters, and relationships. If you've ever picked up a thriller and thought, this is good, but the show just hits different, you are not alone. If you're new here, I'm Stephanie, a lover of all things stories who particularly likes adaptations. Today, we're talking about Prime's TV show Cross Season 1 and the first book in the Alex Cross series, Along Came a Spider by James Patterson. Editing stuff here, so just a quick reminder that there will be spoilers for the book and the adaptation in this video, so if you don't want to be spoiled, use the chapters down below to navigate to my thoughts at the end. I'll share what the show absolutely nailed, what the book still has going for it, and most importantly, what could have been better in both. Along Came a Spider was first published in 1993 and is the first book in the long-running Alex Cross series by James Patterson. It follows Dr. Alex Cross, a homicide detective and psychologist in DC, as he investigates the kidnapping of two high-profile children. Cross, the show, premiered on Amazon Prime in November of 2024 and stars Oscar nominee Aldous Hodge as Dr. Alex Cross. It pulls from several books in the series, but reimagines the world through a modern lens. And y'all, it does not hold back. Let's talk about how each version handles the story itself. I'm going to start with the obvious. The plot in the show just hits harder. First off, Cross isn't afraid to get messy with the timeline and structure, and I loved that. And instead of focusing on the kidnapping case that was in the book, the show throws you into a bigger web of corruption, trauma, and overlapping investigations. It gives you time to breathe and to absorb the emotional stakes. And honestly, it kind of feels more true to life. Real crime doesn't wrap up in 300 pages. Second, the tension feels more personal. In Along Came a Spider, Cross is just dropped into a high-profile kidnapping case. And while the stakes are serious, the case isn't personal to him until the end. In the show, every case reveals something about Alex's past, his grief, or his values. The plot is doing double duty, not just by solving a crime, but also revealing things about Alex's life and who Alex is at his core. Third, the pacing and tension in the show just feel more modern. In the book, we're told almost immediately who the kidnapper is, and that really dilutes the suspense. The show, on the other hand, teases you with layers of mystery. The fanboy figure evolves into something more unsettling the more you learn. You're never quite sure what's coming next. Now, even though the show was stronger for me personally, the book still had a lot going for it. Namely, it's a tight, focused crime story. If you're in the mood for a straight-up thriller with a beginning, middle, and end, Along Came a Spider is going to deliver that. The book doesn't try to juggle 10 different threads like the show does. It's a single case that's high profile with high consequences. And that simplicity can be a strength, especially if you're looking for a quick read. 2, the book is where the idea of this media bias and public perception that Cross faces in the show comes from. The moment where Cross realizes that the disappearance of a Black girl barely registers in the media, while the white children are immediately national news, that was powerful, and it's something that still resonates over 20 years later. And the book doesn't dance around that reality. It confronts it head on. And that made the stakes of the case feel much more layered. Even though I didn't love the villain reveal in the book, I do think that the structure of the twist, that the kidnapping was just a part of a greater psychological game, was interesting. And you can see the bones of what the show later expands on in the book, for sure. The book may not have landed for me as much emotionally, but the groundwork for what the show becomes is definitely there in the book. Even though I definitely preferred Cross to the book, neither is perfect, so here are some things that I think could have been better overall. Let's be real. Along Came a Spider has a twisty setup, but once you know who did it and why, the second half kind of meanders. And while Cross builds incredible tension early on, the last 2 episodes feel pretty rushed, like it was trying to wrap up too much without giving each individual storyline the time that it deserved. Both versions start strong, but the payoff could have been better in both. The book has a clear setup. 2 kids are kidnapped, but the plot tries to pull off too many twists, and it just ends up feeling a little bit all over the place. Meanwhile, the show has the opposite problem. There's so much going on, so many emotional layers and overlapping storylines, that sometimes it's a little hard to figure out what the true focus of the storyline is. A little more balance would have helped both land their emotional and narrative arcs better. In Along Came a Spider, the plot twist with the multiple personality disorder is obviously meant to be shocking, but it really hasn't aged well. It leans into heavily outdated, sensationalized depictions of mental illness, and it feels a little bit more exploitative than insightful. The show, to its credit, ditches this storyline completely and opts for a more grounded, modern villain. But even then, some of the motivations behind Fanboy felt kind of shallow. I think both versions would have benefited from a deeper dive into what would drive a person to do the things that this villain does, without relying on tropes that misrepresent mental health. Now that we've tackled the plot, let's dive into the heart of the story, the characters. Along Came a Spider gives us a very complex villain, morally ambiguous Jesse, and of course, Dr. Alex Cross. So how do these characters compare between the book and the show? Let's break it down. In Along Came a Spider, Jesse Flanagan is introduced as competent, emotionally composed, and good at her job. She works closely with Cross and builds a sense of trust, not just with him, but with the reader as well. There were even moments where she lets her guard down and you feel like she is being truly vulnerable. At first, she feels like a fully realized character. But then the story pivots. Jesse disappears from the narrative, and when she reappears, it's as part of a twist that rewrites everything we thought we knew about her. The emotional complexity that we thought we knew earlier suddenly becomes questionable. Rather than exploring that betrayal in depth, the book uses it more for shock value than character growth. It's abrupt and leaves a lot of potential on the table. In the Cross TV show, there is no Jesse, but her narrative function gets split across several different characters, namely Chief Anderson, Special Agent Kayla Craig, and El Montero. And I think that's a clever adaptation choice, which we'll get into more in the relationship section. By splitting Jesse's arc, the show manages to avoid flattening a complex character into a single dramatic reveal. Each of these women has space to exist outside of Alex. It creates a richer, more layered narrative that avoids the trusted woman becomes villain trope, as that trope is often overused and mishandled. When it comes to the antagonist, Cross didn't just update Gary Sinegi. They evolved him. And honestly, that evolution made a lot of difference for me. In Along Came a Spider, Gary Sinegi is the typical monster hiding in plain sight. He's a school teacher, a husband, a father. On the surface, he's ordinary, maybe even admirable. But underneath, he's a person who's been obsessed with making a headline crime since he was a child. He's fascinated by fame, infamy, and serial killers. It's unsettling. The big twist that he may be suffering from multiple personality disorder really just, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't age well. In fact, it actually feels like it undermines everything compelling about this cruelty that he has. Cross said, "Let's talk about a monster who's already at the top of the food chain." Ed Ramsey is a whole different kind of terrifying. He's not trying to become somebody. He already is. He's a billionaire with deep government ties, dripping with entitlement, and convinced of his own superiority. Unlike Sinegi, Ramsey's crimes are fueled by the need for attention. They're rooted in control and the belief that the world should bend to his will. It's a kind of villainy that seems chillingly real nowadays. Both characters are long-term planners with deep-rooted narcissism. But Ramsey weaponizes wealth and influence, while Sinegi utilizes anonymity and manipulation. They're both socially respected, but only one of them is protected by systems of power that shield them from consequence. The show also smartly keeps the theme of hidden darkness through Ramsey's public persona. He's disturbingly calm, soft-spoken, intelligent, calculated, until he's not. The result is a character that's just as obsessed with his image as Sinegi is, but scarier because the system enables him. There's even a hint of shared religious trauma among both characters. Soneji calls his stepmother the whore of Babylon, revealing the warped worldview that helped to shape him. Ramsey, too, leans into a kind of cult-like righteousness, so it's more ideological than overtly religious. His belief in his own purpose feels biblical in scale, and that makes him even more dangerous. So while Soneji gave us a snapshot of late 90s villainy, Ed Ramsey is a villain that fits into the world that we have now. More subtle, more powerful, and infinitely more terrifying. Now let's talk about Alex. In Along Came a Spider, we're introduced to Alex, who has obviously been through some trauma, but there's a distance between him and that pain. His wife's murder happened years before the story begins, and while it's obviously shaped who he is, it doesn't seem to weigh on him in the moment. He mentions it, he even dresses for the day like he's entering into a battlefield. But that's honestly more about him trying to navigate his way through the world as a black man in a white-dominated space. It's not really about his personal grief. The emotional impact is real, but it's muted because he's already learned to live with that ache. But in Cross, the grief is fresh. It's bleeding through everything that he does. The show opens up with the immediate aftermath of his wife's murder. And while we don't watch in quite real time, that trauma is still like freshly carved into him. He's not just carrying around that loss, he's actively trying to figure out how to survive it. That alone makes his arc feel more grounded and more human. You see the sleepless nights, the quiet moments when he's not just the profiler or the cop, but a man just trying to learn to survive with his loss and trying to hold it all together for his kids. What I love about this change is that the TV show doesn't just let him hurt. It gives him the space to process. It's messy. He's sometimes reckless and sometimes very reactive. He spirals, and that makes him seem so much more real. This isn't the Alex who's learned how to take that weight off his shoulders. He's still actively trying to figure out how to carry it. That journey is emotionally resonant, and it makes every decision and every mistake hit harder. The show also anchors his grief in community. The people around him aren't just side characters, they're his lifelines. In the book, Alex feels more solitary. Thoughtful, yes. Insightful? Definitely. But emotionally walled off in a way that keeps you at arm's length. In the show, we're invited inside. And that vulnerability doesn't just make him a strong protagonist, it makes him a relatable one. So while the book gives us an Alex that has already developed that scar tissue, the show gives us the healing as it's happening. And that choice, mixed with Aldous Hodge's acting ability, made a big difference for me in how I saw Alex as a character. Of course, Alex isn't just defined by his grief or his work, it's his relationships that give all of this meaning. Whether it's the people helping him hold it together or the people who is challenging his trust in justice, the connections that he forms are at the center of both the book and the show. So let's dig into the relationships and how they matter, how they're built, how they break, and what they reveal about who Alex is. In Along Came a Spider, the relationship between Alex and Jesse is emotionally layered, romantically charged, and ultimately tragic. Their connection feels spontaneous, even sweet at times. There's chemistry, shared grief, and vulnerability. But the fact that it is an interracial relationship is never very far from the surface. There are moments in the book where Alex is definitely aware of how their relationship is perceived, not just by others, but by himself. And Nana Mama doesn't hold back. She voices the discomfort and mistrust that comes from a long history of injustice and inequality in America between Black men and white women. The book touches on this tension, but rather than exploring it fully, it uses it as a foothold for the betrayal. Jesse's eventual disappearance and her role in the case casts a shadow over the entire relationship. What could have been a thoughtful exploration into interracial relationships in a racially fraught system brings forth another example of how a white woman seems to care until she doesn't. That choice reinforces generational mistrust, not just in Alex, but in the reader as well. Though lately I know that mistrust is obviously very earned. In Amazon's Cross, that relationship is notably absent. Instead of introducing Jesse, the show builds Alex's relationship around an emotional support network of Black characters, including Samson, Nana Mama, and Elle. And honestly, that choice feels intentional and long overdue. Centering Alex's emotional relationships around Black people reshapes the narrative from one of betrayal to one of community. It allows space for the representation of Black care, strength, and complexity without turning any of those characters into a cautionary tale. Elle, in particular, offers a perspective grounded in shared history and cultural context. Her presence doesn't just support Alex, it grounds him, even though he is definitely not ready to be in another relationship. It seems pretty easy in retrospect to see why the showrunners would think that Jesse was unnecessary altogether. In a cultural moment where representation and the way people are represented matters more than ever, the choice to build intimate, layered relationships between Alex and the Black community feels deliberate. It moves the focus away from trauma tropes and towards resilience, healing, and solidarity. One of the strongest and most consistent relationships between Along Came a Spider and Cross is the relationship between Alex and his partner, Samson. In the book, Samson is a rock. He's the kind of friend who shows up, no questions asked, and somehow always seems to know what Alex needs, even when Alex doesn't. Their connection is deep, intuitive, and long-standing. You can really feel the years behind it. He's a protector, a confidant, and someone who brings stability to Alex when Alex is having his more volatile moments. But in Cross, that relationship becomes even more emotionally textured. The show leans into their connection as Black men trying to move through a space that doesn't allow room for their grief and anger. Samson isn't just the guy who's got Alex's back. He's the one who's going to pull him out of the spiral.
You're not managing very well.
He knows when to challenge him and when to just let him sit in silence. Their bond feels lived in and layered, and the show gives them the space that relationship needs to breathe. And one of the things I really love is that Cross doesn't shy away from the vulnerability in this relationship. Both men are going through it. Alex is grieving, unraveling, and trying to keep himself together for his kids. And Samson is there for every beat of that journey. The relationship isn't defined by tough guy banter or bravado. It's about trust, shared history, and emotional accountability. And that is such a rare thing to see portrayed on TV, especially between two Black men in a crime drama. While the book absolutely establishes that their bond is strong, the show lets that bond take center stage. It allows their friendship to be soft and real, and that choice adds so much emotional depth. In Along Came a Spider, we know Alex is a father. We do see small moments with his children, tender, quiet scenes that show his love for them. But those moments are fleeting. His kids feel more like symbols of what he's fighting for rather than characters in their own right. They exist more on the periphery, safe at home, while he's out chasing down criminals. There's love, clearly, but there's also distance, both emotionally and narratively. In Cross, that relationship is not only present, it's central. The show doesn't just remind us that Alex is a father. It shows us what that looks like day to day in his life. It shows us the cost of what it's like to raise two children who are grieving the loss of their mother. Their presence adds an emotional immediacy that the book just doesn't have. Alex isn't just a brilliant detective. He's a single dad navigating bedtime stories, emotional breakdowns, and the impossible task of trying to be both protector and provider when he's barely keeping himself together. And the choice to give his children more screen time, more voice, and to have more impact on Alex's decision-making makes the story feel more grounded. It's one thing to say a character is doing all of this for his kids. It's another thing to actually see him trying to juggle making breakfast with solving a murder case, or breaking down in the hallway because he can't fix what's broken. And through it all, his kids aren't just there to soften him. They're there to challenge him. They need him to show up, and sometimes he can't. And that tension is raw and very real. So while the book gives us a glimpse of the father that Alex wants to be, the show lets us live in the heartbreak, the exhaustion, and the love of a father who's doing everything he can, even when it's not enough. And that more than any crime he solves gives Cross its emotional core. So, as you know, I always watch the adaptation before reading the book when I do these book versus adaptation videos. So, I already had this emotionally layered, deeply human version of Alex Cross in my mind, and that's always going to hook me pretty much immediately. Then I read the book. And while I enjoyed the fast paced plot and could see the bones of what we get in the TV show, it felt really distant in comparison. I found myself missing the vulnerability, the rawness, and the sense of community that made the show so powerful. The book may have provided the blueprint, but the show is what stuck with me. If you've seen Cross or read Along Came a Spider, let me know in the comments below which you preferred. If you just want to let me know that you're here, leave me a spider emoji. And if you're into book versus adaptations, check out my last one here. Let's see what stories tomorrow brings.